Why did no one else see what she saw? The men leaned over satellite photos, tracing rooftops and roads with calloused fingers, but their eyes slid past the small details. The kinds of details only someone like her noticed. Sarah Martinez sat quietly at the edge of the briefing table, headset still looped around her neck, as Commander tapped the compound with his pen. "That's it, the house. Our target will be there." The voices around her carried the hard certainty of warriors who had done this 100 times. She wasn't one of them. Not a SEAL. Not bred for this room of hard shoulders and quick decisions. She was an intelligence officer, a woman whose weapons were languages, empathy, and the patience to wait for the truth to reveal itself. Her eyes drifted again to the satellite printout spread across the table. The courtyard of the compound was visible, a few blurred shapes casting faint shadows. Most saw them as debris. She saw them for what they were, toys. Small, scattered, brightly colored in the washed-out image. Her stomach nodded. Children, families, not just a target house, not just coordinates on a map. She swallowed. "Commander," she said, her voice even but softer than she meant. "Look again. That courtyard, those are toys. This isn't just a families live there." The room fell silent for a moment. Some of the men leaned in, squinting, their skepticism giving way to recognition. One of the younger operators muttered under his breath, "Damn." Ran a hand through his hair, that familiar gesture she had already learned to read. It meant he was weighing, calculating, feeling the press of two impossible truths. Their target, the bomb maker who had taken so many lives, was in there. But so were children. Sarah's chest tightened as memories flickered in her mind. Faces of Iraqi families she had once interviewed, women clutching their children, eyes hollow with fear. She had promised herself she wouldn't let those faces fade into statistics, not if she could help it. "Air strikes off the table," she said before anyone else could. Her voice came sharper this time, louder. "Too many civilians." No one argued. They didn't need to. The silence said it all. For the next 4 hours they turned plans over and over like stones in their hands. A raid, a wait-and watch, a diversion. Each one ended the same. Too many risks, too many unknowns. Every delay meant more convoys on those roads, more soldiers rolling into the deadly traps that this man and his network designed. The radio crackled, slicing through the room like a blade. A convoy, another roadside bomb, 10 miles out. 3 soldiers dead, 2 more clinging to life. The air inside the tent thickened. Sarah felt it like a weight pressing down, heavier than her own body. She looked at the men around her, hardened faces, some blank, some filled with grief. But every one of them carried a memory of someone lost to explosions just like this. His voice was rough when he finally spoke. "We need eyes inside that compound. Someone close enough to know where he is, who else is there, and whether we can move without killing innocents." The words hung heavy. Everyone knew what that meant. Someone would have to go in. Someone would have to walk into the fire. Sarah's heart was already pounding, as though her body knew the decision before her mind had formed the words. She glanced at the operators. Broad frames, unmistakable American soldiers. They could never pass unnoticed through narrow alleys and watchful eyes. Not here. She inhaled slowly. "I'll go." The silence that followed was different this time. Not tactical, not calculating, pure disbelief. Turned to her, jaw tightening. "Sarah, you know what you're saying." "I know." Her voice didn't shake, though her hands trembled against her knees beneath the table. "If they catch you." "I know," she met his gaze. "But the women in that village, they move freely. They see things, hear things, they trust me. I've worked with them for months. I can blend in, I can get close enough." The operators exchanged glances, some with respect, some with concern, none with approval. She didn't blame them. She wasn't built like them. Her battles had always been quieter, rooms where words mattered more than weapons, where survival meant listening harder than anyone else in the room. But she also knew this truth. Sometimes, The smallest voice had to carry the heaviest weight. Her mind flickered again to the 3 soldiers lost that morning. Faces she didn't know, names she would never learn, but families back home already breaking. She couldn't let that continue, not if she could stop it. "I'm sure," she said. The steadiness in her voice surprised even her. Stared at her for a long moment, his eyes narrowing like a man trying to see the truth beneath skin and bone. Finally, he exhaled. "You've got 4 hours of daylight. After that, he's gone again." It was all the approval she would get. The world outside the tent had already begun its slow descent into amber light. Shadows stretched across the mountains, long fingers creeping toward the village where she would soon walk. In the supply tent, she studied herself in the cracked mirror. The blue fabric of the burka fell heavy over her frame, strange yet familiar. She had worn it before while bringing medicine to villages, but never like this, never knowing it might be the last thing she ever wore. Her hands smoothed the cloth, adjusted the folds, tucked away her hair. A bag of medical supplies weighed against her shoulder. Antibiotics, bandages, real tools for real needs. The cover was believable because it wasn't a cover at all. She had been that woman before. Appeared behind her holding out a small book. A prayer book, plain and worn. She met his eyes, knowing there was more to it. "This will track your location," he said quietly. "If things go wrong, we'll know where to find you." She nodded, but they both knew. By the time the signal told them she was in trouble, it might already be too late. The SEAL team took their positions on the ridge above, scopes fixed, rifles ready, watching, waiting. But once she stepped beyond the first alley, she would vanish into a labyrinth only she could walk. Her heart pounded as her feet found the rocky path. Every step felt heavier than the one before. She shifted her gait, lowered her eyes, bent her shoulders just slightly. A woman carrying burdens. A woman who belonged. At the edge of the village, 2 fighters leaned on their rifles at the checkpoint. She didn't lift her eyes, didn't speak, just walked. They barely looked at her. To them she was invisible, another woman in blue. The air inside the village was different. Dusty streets alive with movement, children chasing one another, women carrying water jars, men leaning in doorways. Life unfolding, fragile, ordinary, unaware that death had taken root inside its walls. Sarah moved slowly, carefully, each breath steady, each glance measured. Yet beneath the burka her pulse raced. Her mind replayed its warning, just observe. Report, don't try to be a hero. She whispered the words to herself like a mantra. But in the deepest part of her chest, a voice whispered back, what if there is no one else? Every corner she turned, every door she passed felt like a choice. Forward or back, risk or safety, courage or survival. And still, her feet carried her deeper into the alleys, toward the place where children's toys lay forgotten in the courtyard of a house that was no longer a home. What was Fatima so afraid of? The moment the door opened, Sarah saw it in her eyes, fear that went deeper than the everyday anxieties of survival. It was the kind of fear that lived in the body, not just the face. "Sister Sarah," Fatima whispered, her voice sharp with urgency. She pulled her inside, slamming the wooden door shut against the narrow alley. "It is dangerous for you here today." Dangerous. The word sent a pulse of cold through Sarah's veins. She lowered her bag to the floor and adjusted the burka, her breath hot beneath the fabric. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked in Pashto, keeping her tone calm though her chest felt tight. Fatima glanced toward the blankets that divided her small home into makeshift rooms. Her children played quietly in the shadows, as though even laughter had been muted by the atmosphere. She lowered her voice until it was almost a hiss. "There are new men in the village, dangerous men. They came 3 days ago and took over the compound." Sarah's pulse quickened. That name, that compound, exactly where the intelligence reports had marked their target. She had expected it to be true, but hearing it confirmed, hearing it spoken in fear, made it heavier. "Are the family safe?" she asked. The men were told to leave. Only the women and children remain. They have no choice. These new men, they use them as cover. Fatima's hands trembled as she spoke. Everyone knows not to go near the compound now. Sarah's mind raced. She had walked these villages before, had sat in homes just like this, offering medicine, listening to stories. She knew how families clung to survival in silence. But now those families were human shields. "How many men?" she asked softly. 8, 10, maybe more, but today more arrived. Many more, loud voices, strange sounds. The children hear things, explosives, weapons. I think something is coming. Sarah looked at the children in the corner, their small faces drawn with worry. She forced a smile for them, but her thoughts churned. 8 or 10 fighters would have been bad enough. But dozens, an entire operation. It wasn't just a bomb maker anymore. It was a network, a storm gathering inside the walls of a family home. The plan had been simple: slip into the village, observe, gather intelligence. Nothing more. But the reality was already unraveling. There was no way to know what was inside that compound without getting closer. She tried to think like an officer, like the analyst she had been trained to be. Alternatives, risks, exits. But every option led back to the same wall. Without direct observation, they had nothing. And without something, convoys would keep rolling into death traps. "Fatima," she said carefully, "is there anyone in the compound who might need medical care? A reason for me to enter?" Fatima's eyes widened with alarm, as though Sarah had spoken the most reckless thought imaginable. "No, no, you cannot. They will kill you." "Listen," Sarah pressed, her voice low, urgent. "If there is someone sick—" Fatima hesitated, then whispered, "The grandmother. Bibi, she is very sick, coughing blood for weeks, but the men do not let anyone help her." A door cracked open in Sarah's mind. Risky, suicidal even, but a door nonetheless. What if they believed I was here to treat her? Fatima shook her head. "They trust no outsiders." "But they trust doctors more than soldiers." Sarah leaned forward. "I've done this before. I speak the language. I know the customs. If they let me in, I can see everything. Who's there, what they're planning, how many civilians are trapped." Fatima studied her, eyes filling with tears. "If they discover you are not who you say—" "They won't." The words left Sarah's mouth faster than she believed them. She forced her voice steady. "They won't." But deep inside, the truth pressed hard against her ribs. She was no longer following the plan. She was breaking it, bending it, stepping into a space no training manual could guide her through. As the afternoon shadows stretched longer across the village walls, Sarah adjusted her burka, lifted her medical bag, and walked with Fatima toward the compound that no one dared approach. Every step felt heavier, the alleys narrowing, the murmur of voices echoing against. Her breath caught when the gate appeared at the end of the lane, larger, darker, guarded by 2 armed men. The rifles they carried weren't the rusted relics she had seen in local hands. These were clean, oiled, military-grade, professionals. She forced her pace slower, humble, burdened, a woman with no threat in her hands, only medicine in her bag. "I am here to treat Bibi," she said in Pashto, lowering her head respectfully. "She is sick. Her family worries she will die." The taller of the 2 guards stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. His gaze scanned her clothing, her posture, the bag at her side. His silence stretched long enough to dry her throat. "Who sent you?" he demanded. "Her family," she replied, opening her bag just enough to show the antibiotics. "I have helped many sick women here. They trust me." The men exchanged words in Arabic. Sarah kept her face blank, feigning ignorance, though she caught enough to know what they were debating: risk versus need. Let her in or turn her away. Minutes passed like hours. Finally, the gate groaned open. "You will treat only the old woman," the guard said. "You will speak to no one else. When you finish, you leave." Sarah bowed her head, hiding the flicker of adrenaline that spiked through her veins. "Yes." The moment she stepped through, the world changed. The courtyard was no longer a family's home. It was a staging ground for war. Boxes of ammunition lined the walls. Wires and explosives sprawled across tables. Men moved with grim purpose, cleaning rifles, assembling devices, muttering over maps. But it wasn't just the weapons that chilled her. It was the corner. Women and children huddled together, eyes wide, pressed against the wall like shadows. Hostages, not guests, not family, prisoners. Sarah's throat tightened. The toys she had seen in the satellite photo, here they were, scattered near the feet of children who no longer played. A young woman approached, clutching her shawl. "Are you the doctor, please? My grandmother is inside." Sarah nodded, following her into a darkened room where an elderly woman lay coughing on a thin mattress. Her breaths rattled with every rise of her chest. Pneumonia, maybe worse. Without treatment she had days, maybe hours. As Sarah unpacked her supplies, voices drifted from beyond the wall. Men speaking fast, sharp, urgent. She caught fragments. Convoy tomorrow, 3 locations. Her blood chilled. The target was here. She knew the voice, low and commanding, and the plans. This wasn't one strike. It was coordinated, simultaneous, deadly. She forced her hands steady as she gave the grandmother antibiotics, but her mind was racing. Memorizing tones, words, names, building a map in her head. Every detail mattered. "Doctor," the young woman whispered near her ear, "they say they will kill us if we try to leave. We are trapped." Sarah glanced at the terrified faces outside the door, then back to the frail body beneath her hands. She swallowed hard. She had walked into this place for intelligence. But now there were lives at stake, innocent lives in every corner. Her work finished, she began to pack. But as she slid the bottles back into her bag, she felt it, eyes on her. A man stood in the doorway watching. His expression carried suspicion, not curiosity. He studied her hands, her shoes, her walk. "You are not from this village," he said in accented Pashto. Her chest tightened. "I travel between villages," she answered calmly, "helping the sick." His eyes narrowed further. "Your hands are too soft, your shoes too clean, you walk like a soldier." For one moment, Sarah's heart seemed to stop. Her training whispered through her nerves, control the breath, steady the tone, deny without denying. But before she could answer, the grandmother erupted into a violent cough. The man's gaze flicked toward the bed, the sound pulling his suspicion away for an instant. It was only a heartbeat of relief, but sometimes a heartbeat was all survival allowed. Sarah lowered her head, feigning submission, even as her mind whispered the truth. Her cover was a thread fraying fast, and once it snapped, there would be no escape. How long could she keep the lie alive? The suspicious man hadn't moved. His weapon rested casually at his side, but his eyes locked onto hers like a predator deciding when to strike. "You walk like a soldier," he repeated, slower this time. Sarah lowered her head, keeping her breath steady. "I only walk as my father taught me. He was a teacher. He insisted I walk straight." The lie slipped easily into her tongue, years of practice coating it with calm. But calm couldn't hide the truth pulsing beneath her skin. She was seconds away from discovery. Another man joined him, muttering in Arabic. Sarah kept her expression blank, though she understood every word. "Check her. If she carries something, we'll know." Her heart thudded in her chest as rough hands patted down her clothing. She forced herself not to flinch, not to stiffen. Her prayer book, the hidden comms device, was tucked inside her inner pocket. If their search went a fraction deeper, everything would unravel. The search stopped just short. Voices rose suddenly from the courtyard, an argument, men shouting about timing, about whether the convoy attacks were moving too quickly. The suspicious man cursed under his breath and turned his head. The argument outside pulled his attention, just long enough. Sarah seized the sliver of reprieve, bowing her head again as though tending to her supplies, but her mind was racing. The shouting voices weren't just anger, they were urgency. The plan was already in motion. She needed proof, more than fragments, more than whispers. Her eyes slid to the hallway beyond the room. Just for a moment she let herself drift that way, as if by accident. The men were distracted, arguing louder now. Her steps carried her deeper into the house, past the sleeping mats, past the cracked plaster walls, toward the room where the voices were sharpest. Through a half-open door she saw it. A table covered in maps, roads marked in red, arrows pointing at convoy routes, circles around ambush points, handwritten notes scattered with names, times, codes. Her breath caught. This wasn't just about tomorrow. It was about weeks of attacks, dozens of routes, dozens of soldiers. The voice she knew, low, commanding, cut through the noise. The target himself. He leaned over the maps, stabbing a finger at the lines as he gave orders. Sarah's heart hammered so hard she thought they would hear it. She forced herself to memorize every detail. The roads, the times, the sequence. If she could carry even half of it back, dozens of lives would be spared. But before she could turn away, footsteps closed in behind her. The suspicious man. "Turn around," he ordered, his weapon raised. Sarah froze. Every nerve screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. Slowly she turned. His gun barrel leveled at her chest, only feet away. "You don't belong here," he said. His voice was steady, too steady. He had already decided. Her mind scrambled. Her cover was unraveling, thread by thread, and there was no way to stitch it back together. "Please," she whispered in Pashto, letting tears sting her eyes. "I was only looking for water to help the grandmother take her medicine." The man sneered, not lowering his weapon. Behind him, Sarah could still see the maps, still see the lines that meant death for convoys already rolling tomorrow. She had memorized much, but not enough. Not enough. "Bring her," the man barked to his companion. "The commander will decide." Two hands grabbed her arms, rough and unyielding, and dragged her down the hallway. Sarah's chest tightened with every step. She had known this was possible. She had even prepared for it in training. But the reality, the grip on her arms, the weapon at her back was different, more suffocating. The room fell silent when she was shoved inside. Around the table, 8 men stared. At the head of it sat the target, younger than the photos, but his eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen and caused death 1,000 times. "Who is this?" he demanded, his voice low but sharp. "She claims to be a doctor," the suspicious man said, pressing her forward. "I think she is a spy." Sarah kept her head bowed. Her mind replayed every briefing, every warning. Observe, report, do not try to be a hero. But heroism wasn't a choice anymore. It was survival. "I only came to help the sick grandmother," she whispered. "I want no trouble." The target studied her. His gaze felt like fire on her skin, searing through the fabric of her disguise. "You speak too well," he said. "Too well for a village doctor." Sarah forced her voice steady. "My father was a teacher. He wanted his daughter to speak properly." One of the men leaned to whisper in his ear. The target's face darkened. Sarah caught fragments of the words. The attacks weren't tomorrow evening. They were at dawn. Earlier, closer, deadlier. Her chest tightened. If she didn't get this information out, convoys would roll straight into ambushes within hours. The target's hand flicked dismissively. "Take her outside. When we are finished, we will decide what to do with her." The men yanked her arms again, pulling her toward the courtyard, toward the weapons, the detonators, the hostages. As she stumbled forward, she saw it. The detonator box near the entrance, wires exposed, volatile compounds stacked too close together. One spark would unravel it all. Her breath caught. She could trigger chaos. Enough for the women and children to flee, enough for her to signal the SEALs, enough to shatter the plan before dawn. But it would also likely kill her. Her mind spun through the faces, the convoy soldiers barely older than her brother. The women huddled against the wall, eyes wide with terror. The choice burned inside her. Wait, hope the seals moved in time, or act now, risk everything, maybe die. Her boot caught on the edge of a rug. She stumbled deliberately, crashing against the table holding the detonators. Sparks erupted. Shouts filled the air. Explosives popped, smoke rising. Men dove for cover. The courtyard exploded into chaos. Sarah screamed in Pashto, "Run, get out now." The hostages bolted, children clutching their mothers, scrambling through the gate. Gunfire erupted, bullets snapped overhead. Sarah dove behind a wall, heart pounding, lungs burning. Her hand found the prayer book, the device now blinking. Activated. The SEALs would know. But they were too far. She was alone, pinned, 6 rounds in her pistol, at least 8 men hunting her. The target's voice cut through the smoke. "Find the woman, kill her." Sarah's chest heaved. Her body trembled, but her mind steeled. This wasn't about orders anymore. This was about survival and about not letting death reach those convoys. Somewhere beyond the smoke, a helicopter's distant thrum began to rise. Help was coming, but not fast enough. How many seconds could one life buy? The courtyard was a storm of chaos, smoke, shouting, gunfire cracking against stone walls. Sarah pressed her back to the cold brick, pistol clutched tight in her hand, heart hammering so hard it drowned out thought. She checked the magazine. 6 rounds. That was all. 6 rounds against at least 8 trained fighters who knew this compound better than she ever could. "Find her," the target's voice roared above the din. His men fanned out, weapons raised, searching the smoke-filled corners. Sarah closed her eyes for half a second, steadying her breath. Fear clawed at her throat, but she forced it down. Control the pace. Breathe. Think. The sound of rotor blades thumped faintly in the distance. Helicopters. The SEALs had called in air support, but they were minutes away, maybe more. And minutes were lives. A burst of gunfire chewed into the wall inches from her head. She ducked, rolled to another corner and returned fire. One shot missed. Second shot hit. A man dropped, his rifle clattering against the dirt. 5 rounds left. She ducked again as bullets tore through the smoke. Dust rained from the crumbling wall above her. Her chest heaved. She wasn't built for this, not firefights, not close-quarter combat, but training took over where fear wanted to reign. Move. Relocate. Don't stay pinned. She sprinted across the courtyard, low and fast, diving behind another barricade as shouts erupted. Gunfire followed, shredding the space she had just abandoned. Through the haze she saw them, the women and children she had shouted at moments before. Their silhouettes darted toward the open gate, stumbling, clutching each other. Alive, escaping. Relief flickered, brief as a heartbeat. Then the weight returned. The maps, the plans, the network of death still lying on that table. If the target escaped with them, this chaos would mean nothing. Sarah clenched her jaw. She couldn't let him go. A shadow moved near the house. The target himself, slipping inside, gathering documents, trying to salvage the plan. Her breath caught. It had to be now, before he vanished into the smoke. She darted from cover, gunfire chasing her steps, and pushed through the doorway into the dim interior of the house. The target spun, his rifle already rising. Time slowed. Sarah saw his eyes, cold, calculating, unflinching. This was the man responsible for so many deaths, the architect of ambushes that had torn through convoys, the reason she had walked into this fire. Her pistol came up. She fired twice. The shots echoed like thunder in the confined space. His body jerked, then collapsed against the table, papers scattering like broken promises. For a heartbeat, silence. Her chest heaved. The weight of the pistol pulled heavy in her hand. She had fired before in training, in controlled drills, but this was different. This was close enough to see his eyes widen, close enough to smell the gunpowder. Her fingers trembled. She had crossed a line no training could prepare her for. But there was no time. She shoved the scattered maps into her bag, hands moving fast, every paper more valuable than gold. Routes, timelines, networks stretching across provinces. Not just one cell, not just one man, a web. The sound of boots pounded outside, fighters shouting, they knew. Sarah turned, pistol raised, but her body lagged behind her fear. Another fighter filled the doorway, rifle aimed at her chest. Too slow. Her breath froze as his finger tightened on the trigger. And then the crack of a rifle split the air. The fighter dropped, blood pooling at his feet. Through the smoke, a voice called steady, almost casual. "Area secure, ma'am." Petty officer, one of the SEAL snipers, lowered his weapon from the courtyard, eyes still scanning for threats. His grin was thin, edged with worry. "Sarah." Commander burst through the door with two more operators, weapons raised, scanning every corner. His eyes locked on her, the pistol still shaking in her grip, the dead target at her feet, the bag of papers clutched tight in her hand. For a moment neither spoke, then Sarah lifted the bag, her voice raw. "I got the intel." The relief in his face was sharp but fleeting. His gaze dropped to the body on the floor. He knew what it meant, that she hadn't just gathered information. She had pulled the trigger, face to face. Gunfire still rattled outside as the SEALs cleared the compound. The whir of helicopters grew louder, closer, shadows sweeping across the courtyard. Sarah stumbled into the open air, lungs burning with smoke. The compound was nearly secured now, fighters either dead or fleeing, civilians gathered and shielded by operators who spoke gently in broken Pashto. But Sarah barely saw it. She sank to the ground, her hands trembling against the dirt, the weight of the pistol still heavy even as she dropped it beside her. The medic crouched at her side, checking her for wounds. She shook her head. No injuries, not on the outside. Her eyes lifted to the gate, where women and children huddled, their faces etched with both terror and relief. One of them met her gaze, the young woman who had begged for her grandmother's life. Their eyes held for a single heartbeat, enough to say everything words couldn't. Sarah's chest tightened. She had saved them. She had saved soldiers who would never know her name. But the cost was a piece of herself she wasn't sure she could ever reclaim. Crouched beside her, voice low, firm. "You realize what you did was against orders." She met his eyes, her voice barely more than a whisper. "If I hadn't, those convoys." He nodded slowly, the weight of unspoken truth between them. Orders were one thing, lives were another, and sometimes the line blurred in ways no commander wanted to admit. The helicopters lifted off minutes later, carrying them back toward the base. Sarah stared out at the mountains rolling beneath her, her reflection faint in the darkened window. She tried to imagine how she would explain it to her family, how she had walked into a compound disguised as a doctor, sat in a room with killers, pulled the trigger at point-blank range. How could words capture the sound of detonators sparking, the smell of smoke, the eyes of children running for freedom? They couldn't. But she carried it all anyway, pressed into the silence of her chest, knowing it would follow her long after the dust of Afghanistan settled behind her. For the first time she understood what had once told her. Orders were simple, the human cost never was. How do you explain to yourself what you can't explain to anyone else? The helicopter's rotors beat against the night sky, thundering through Sarah's bones as she sat rigid against the bench. Her helmet rested heavy on her head, but it wasn't the weight of gear pressing down. It was something else, something she couldn't shake. She stared at her hands. They trembled despite her efforts to still them. Minutes ago, those hands had held a pistol, steady enough to take a life. Now empty, they shook like fragile branches in the wind. Across from her, Commander studied her silently. His eyes were tired but not judgmental. He had seen men come off missions like this before, silent, shaken, changed. But this was different. She wasn't one of his SEALs. She wasn't trained to live inside firefights, to kill without hesitation. She was an intelligence officer who had stepped into a fire no one had asked her to enter. And yet she had survived it. The helicopter touched down at the forward operating base, dust swirling around them. Sarah rose with the others, her body moving by muscle memory, though her mind lagged behind. Inside the operations tent, analysts swarmed the bag she carried. The maps, the notes, the timelines, each paper pulled from her hands felt like it was lifting a piece of her soul with it. Multiple cells, one analyst murmured, eyes wide. 3 provinces, at least 12 different nodes. Another leaned closer to a marked convoy route. If this is accurate, they would hit us tomorrow. 3 convoys, nearly 100 personnel on the move. Sarah sat quietly at the edge of the table, her body still, her ears full of words that blurred together. Convoys, attacks, networks, numbers. She heard it all, but it didn't register the way it used to. Once, intelligence had been a puzzle to her, pieces fitting into place, clean, logical, almost satisfying. Tonight it was different. Because tonight she knew what it cost to bring those pieces back. His voice cut through the noise, low but firm. We need to alert command. Get this up the chain. The analysts nodded, already moving with urgency. Sarah exhaled slowly, her eyes drifting down to the dirt floor. She had done her job, more than her job, and yet there was no relief. Only the echo of gunfire in her ears, the memory of the target's eyes in the split second before he fell. Later, in the quiet of her bunk, sleep wouldn't come. She lay on her back, staring at the canvas above her, replaying the mission over and over. Not the victory, not the intelligence, just the faces. The women pressed against the courtyard wall, the children clutching their mothers' skirts, the old woman coughing blood as Sarah held her hand, and the man, the enemy, collapsing in front of her, his eyes locked on hers. Every detail burned into her mind, unblinking. When dawn finally broke, Sarah dragged herself to the mess hall, her coffee untouched as she stared at the steam curling upward. Slid into the seat across from her. His presence was steady, grounding, but his voice was gentle in a way she hadn't expected. You saved a lot of lives yesterday, he said. Sarah didn't look up. I know, her voice was flat, tired, but I keep seeing their faces, the women, the kids, they were just caught in it, they didn't choose this. That's what makes you good at what you do, replied. You don't just see the mission, you see the people. Sarah's throat tightened. She wanted to believe him, but the truth was harder, because if she really saw the people, every single one, then she would never stop feeling the weight of what she had done. 3 days later, she was called into the commander's office. A paper sat on the desk, words written in the precise, sterile language of military citations. You're being recommended for a Bronze Star, the commander said, with Combat V. Sarah blinked, unsure if she had heard right. Exceptional courage, he continued. Initiative under fire. The intelligence you recovered disrupted a network of attacks that would have killed dozens, maybe more. Her stomach turned. A medal, a decoration, a story others would want to celebrate. But what about the story she carried inside? The smoke, the blood, the eyes of a dying man who had looked at her not as an officer, not as a woman, but as the one who had ended his life. She nodded politely, murmured "Thank you, sir," and left the room. But inside, the weight of the medal already felt heavier than anything she could wear. That night, the nightmares began. Not every night, but often enough. She would wake gasping, drenched in sweat, her heart racing as though the firefight had never ended. Sometimes it was the target's face she saw, his eyes locking onto hers in the moment before the shot. Other times it was the detonators sparking, the courtyard exploding into chaos, children screaming as smoke filled the air. She tried to push the images away during the day, but they bled into her thoughts when she least expected it. A cup of coffee steaming too long reminded her of smoke. A slammed door sounded like a rifle crack. Her parents called, their voices warm with pride when they heard she might be receiving a medal. She couldn't bring herself to tell them what it meant. Her younger brother, Mike, asked what combat was like. Was it like the movies? He said, his voice curious, almost excited. Sarah forced a small smile. No, not like the movies. She couldn't tell him the truth, that courage felt nothing like glory. It felt like fear pressing down so hard you could barely breathe and still stepping forward because someone else's life depended on it. The weeks passed, but the nightmares stayed. One night after waking in a panic, Sarah sat alone at the edge of her bunk, her hands covering her face. She had survived the mission. She had saved lives. But in the quiet, none of that mattered. What mattered was the silence that followed, the silence of the man she had killed, the silence of the women whose lives she couldn't forget. The mission had ended, but for her it had only just begun. What does a medal really weigh? 2 months later, Sarah stood in front of the mirror in her dress uniform. The bronze star rested against her chest, polished and perfect. To anyone else it might have looked like honor, but to her it felt like a stone tied around her neck. The ceremony had been small but formal, flags, speeches, family flown in from across the country. Her parents had cried as the medal was pinned on her. Her younger brother, Mike, snapped photos on his phone, grinning with pride. The citation was read aloud, every word crisp and official. Exceptional courage, initiative under fire, devotion to duty. The audience clapped, cameras flashed, and all Sarah could think was how sterile it sounded, how neatly the chaos of that day had been folded into a sentence or two. What citation could capture the smoke burning her lungs, the gun pressed against her chest, the split second when she pulled the trigger and watched a man fall? None. After the ceremony, her family gathered around her, pride shining in their faces. "You were incredible," her father said, his voice thick. "Your mother and I, we can't even describe how proud we are." Her mother clutched her hand. "All those lives you saved, all those families who still have their sons and daughters because of you." Sarah smiled because that's what they needed, but inside the smile felt hollow. Mike slapped her shoulder. "So what was it like? Were you like in the middle of like the movies?" Sarah's throat tightened. She wanted to tell him the truth, that it didn't feel like the movies, that it felt like being trapped in a nightmare you couldn't wake from. That courage didn't roar. It whispered, shaking, forcing you forward even when your knees wanted to collapse. But she couldn't, she just shook her head. Not like the movies. That night in her childhood bedroom, the nightmares returned. The same scenes, looping endlessly, the detonators sparking, the courtyard erupting, the eyes of the man in the last seconds of his life. She woke gasping, clutching the sheets like they might hold her to the earth. Her parents found her in the morning at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold. Her mother placed a hand on her shoulder. "Sweetheart, maybe you should talk to someone." At first, Sarah resisted. She told herself she could handle it, that she just needed time. But the nights kept unraveling. The distance grew between her and her family, her mother's worried glances, her father's silent attempts at comfort, her brother's awkward questions. Finally, she agreed. The Navy assigned her to Dr. Jennifer, a psychologist who specialized in combat trauma. Sarah sat stiffly in the small office the first day, uniform crisp, posture perfect. She didn't know how to begin. Doctor didn't push. She simply asked, "What do you remember most?" Sarah hesitated. Then the words slipped out before she could stop them. "His eyes, the man I killed, I see them every night." The silence that followed felt unbearable, but then Doctor nodded, calm and steady. "That's normal." "Normal?" Sarah almost laughed, bitter and sharp. "Yes," said, "because you didn't just fire a weapon. You made a decision that ended a life to save others. The human mind doesn't just file that away. It lingers. It demands to be felt." Sarah stared at her hands, twisting in her lap. "So what do I do with it? How do I live with it?" Leaned forward. "You don't erase it, you integrate it. You let it become part of your story, not the end of it." The words lingered long after the session, not the end of it. But at night, Sarah still woke gasping, her chest tight, her skin slick with sweat. The nightmares didn't vanish. They shifted, sometimes subtle, sometimes brutal. Some nights it was the women and children she saw, their faces frozen in terror. Other nights it was the silence afterward, the unbearable quiet once the gunfire stopped. Her parents tried to understand, but their world had never touched hers. They asked questions, but Sarah found the answers impossible to give. Her brother, restless and curious, pressed harder. Did you feel like a hero? Did it feel powerful? Hero, the word made her stomach turn. No, she said softly. It felt like being terrified and moving anyway. He didn't understand. She didn't expect him to. The Navy offered her new assignments, a posting at the Pentagon, a promotion to lieutenant commander. On paper, it was success. But on nights when she lay awake staring at the ceiling, none of it felt like a path forward. What felt real, what felt honest, was the memory of the women in that courtyard. The way their eyes had clung to hers, desperate for help. That was the piece she couldn't shake. That was the part that felt unfinished. And somewhere deep inside, Sarah knew her story wasn't over yet. How do you rebuild a life after walking through fire? Months after the medal ceremony, Sarah found herself in a different kind of tent. This one pitched on the edge of a sprawling refugee camp in Jordan. Outside, thousands of families filled the dusty expanse, rows of tarps and corrugated shelters stretching farther than the eye could see. The air was thick with smoke from cooking fires, with children's laughter mingling uneasily with the quiet sobs of those who had lost everything. It was nothing like the forward operating base in Afghanistan. No rifles stacked against walls, no operators cleaning weapons, but it was still just a different kind. Sarah sat at a folding desk, surrounded by stacks of case files. Each file was a story, names, photographs, notes about who they had fled, who they had lost, what dangers might still pursue them. She traced her finger down one page, pausing at the words "two sons missing, possibly recruited by militia." She swallowed. Every folder carried echoes of faces she had seen in that compound, families caught in something they never chose. The Defense Intelligence Agency had recruited her for this work, an assignment that fused her language skills, her combat experience, and her ability to see civilians not just as data points but as people. She interviewed families, gathered fragments of intelligence, and pieced them together into patterns. It was quieter work, but no less vital. Still, some days it weighed heavier than combat, because here there were no clear enemies, just grief, desperation, and survival. One evening, as the desert cooled and the last orange light bled across the horizon, Sarah opened her secure inbox. A message had arrived, rooted through layers of encryption, marked with a sender's address she didn't recognize. Her hand stilled. The subject line was simple: for the doctor. She clicked. The screen filled with a photograph. Fatima, standing in front of a small, modest school building, her 3 children by her side, smiling shyly at the camera. Sarah's breath caught. Beneath the photo, a message in careful English. The network is broken. The villages are safer. Our children can go to school. Tell the brave doctor we pray for her safety every day. She gave us back our lives. Tears blurred the screen. Sarah sat back in her chair, her chest trembling, a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying suddenly lifting. For months, she had wondered about those women and children, wondered if they had survived, wondered if they remembered her. Now she knew. She covered her mouth with her hand, silent tears streaming. They didn't know her real name, her uniform, the medal that hung in her closet. To them, she was just the woman who had walked into their prison, carried medicine, and opened a door for them to run free. That was enough. When she finally composed herself, she printed the photo and pinned it to the wall above her desk. It became her anchor. On the hardest days, when exhaustion dragged at her bones, She looked at those faces and reminded herself why she was here. Over the next months, Sarah built her own small team, young officers eager, sometimes too eager to prove themselves. They admired her combat record, though she rarely spoke of it. Instead, she tried to teach them something else. In one briefing, a lieutenant suggested a direct strike against a suspected militia cell near a refugee settlement. His voice was sharp, his tone confident. Take them out before they move again. Sarah shook her head. Not yet. Before we send anyone in, we figure out who else is in that area. Families, farmers, kids. We don't create more refugees while trying to stop the bad guys. The room fell quiet. The lieutenant frowned but nodded. A week later, the cell was captured in a joint operation with local forces. No civilians hurt. No homes destroyed. It wasn't flashy. It wouldn't make headlines. But it mattered. That night, Sarah sat with her team by the glow of a lantern, listening to the camp outside settle into uneasy sleep. She told them quietly, "Every piece of intel is a person. Don't ever forget that. Behind every map, every file, there's a family just trying to live." Her words lingered in the air, more than any metal could. She began to find a rhythm. Weekly calls with her parents grew easier. Her mother still worried, her father still tried to hide it, but Sarah's voice carried something it hadn't in months: steadiness. "You sound lighter," her mother said one evening. Sarah thought about the photo pinned above her desk. Maybe I am. The nightmares didn't vanish. Some nights she still woke to the echo of detonators, the memory of pulling the trigger. But now there were other images too: Fatima's children, smiling in front of their school. The quiet gratitude in a refugee's eyes when she listened to their story. The fire she had walked through was still inside her. But slowly, she was learning how to carry its light without letting it consume her. What do you do when the world finally grows quiet? For Sarah, silence had once been unbearable. It had carried the echoes of detonators, the faces of civilians, the memory of a man collapsing at her feet. But now, years later, silence carried something different. Not peace, not exactly, but purpose. In her office, pinned above her desk, the photograph of Fatima and her children still hung. The paper had begun to curl at the edges, faded slightly from desert sun and dust. Yet every time Sarah looked at it, the same truth struck her. Lives had continued. Futures had taken root, and she had played some small part in that. She ran her finger down a new file spread across the table. Another refugee camp. Another family displaced by war. Each case meant more questions than answers. But Sarah had learned that answers weren't the only goal. Listening mattered too, bearing witness. Her team gathered around the table, young officers, eager and restless, eyes bright with ambition. They had been chosen for their sharp minds, their fluency in languages, their ability to analyze. But Sarah wanted them to learn something the files couldn't teach. "Before we send a report up the chain," she told them, "I want you to think about the people behind the intelligence. That convoy you're recommending to divert, those are soldiers. 19, 20 years old, kids, and that suspected, look again. Could there be families inside? If you don't ask those questions, you're not doing the job." The room was quiet. They listened, not just because she outranked them, but because her voice carried something deeper, experience carved by fire. Later, one lieutenant approached her privately. "Ma'am, how do you carry it, the responsibility?" Sarah paused, searching for words. "You don't carry it alone. You share it with your team, with the people you protect, with those who came before you." She met his eyes. "But you never pretend it isn't heavy." That night, as the camp outside settled into uneasy rest, Sarah stepped out beneath the stars. The desert air was cool, the sky impossibly vast. She thought about Afghanistan, about the compound, the smoke, the chaos. She thought about sand, where her medal still hung on the wall, no longer a burden but a reminder. She thought, too, about the women who had whispered their fears to her in darkened rooms, trusting her when trust could mean death. Their courage had been quieter than any firefight, quieter but no less fierce. Doctor's words returned to her, "You don't erase it, you integrate it." And Sarah realized that was exactly what she had done. She hadn't left the fire behind. She had carried it with her, reshaped it into light that guided others. Months later, during a weekly call with her parents, her mother asked, "Do you feel happy now?" Sarah considered the question. Happy wasn't the word. She would never be the girl who had left for Afghanistan years ago. Too much had changed. Too much had been burned away. But there was something steadier inside her now. Not happiness, but meaning. Not peace, but purpose. "I feel like I'm where I'm supposed to be," she answered. Her mother smiled softly through the screen. "That's enough." When the call ended, Sarah sat in her quiet office, staring at the bronze star on the wall. It no longer weighed like a stone. It no longer burned like a wound. It simply reminded her of what courage really was. Not the firefight, not the medal, not even the intelligence that saved convoys. Courage was the moment she had lowered her head beneath a burka, stepped into a compound of armed men, and decided that fear would not stop her. It was the moment she had shouted at women and children to run, knowing she might never follow. It was the choice to act, not for glory, not for recognition, but because no one else could and someone had to. And in that realization, she found the words that had eluded her for years. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts.